Hi, everyone. Nice to see all of you. So today we're joined by Felix del Campo. Felix recently completed his PhD in political theory at Queen Mary University, and his research focuses on the global resurgence of the far right and its relationship to cycles of capital accumulation and crisis. We're really delighted to have him with us today to talk about the state, gender and racial violence, and class struggle. So Felix is going to talk about we'll talk for around 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for a Q&A afterwards. But before I hand over to Felix, I should say, for those of you who are new to the Sexuality and Political Economy stream, we host monthly events, broadly sort of on the intersection of gender and sexuality with capitalism. And they're always hosted on the first Tuesday of each month. Next month, we'll be joined by Abira Khan. If you want, you can find all previous events on the HM YouTube channel. And we also have a mailing list that you can sign up to hear about future events. I'll post the links in the comment section in just a bit. But okay, that's all from me. Felix, over to you.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you everyone for coming, and apologies for my weird little presence there down right at the bottom of the slides. I wanted to basically have slides up so that you didn't have to be looking at my face. The plan is to talk for roughly 45 minutes. I maybe try to do it a bit shorter if it's really boring. And by the end of it, maybe we can have a discussion, and ideally we can like elaborate in more things or have suggestions on how to take this a bit further, or maybe tell me that this is all nonsense and I can just get a life or something and get on with other things. Okay, so I'm going to start now. Well, it is a duty to begin this talk by showing solidarity with the Palestinian people and the people in Gaza who are currently being genocided by Israel under the complacency of the West and its imperialist interests, and to cite in the same breath with all the peoples in the world that live under the yoke of despotic states, genocides, ongoing colonialism, and whose conditions for self-determination are systematically denied. Because I believe that none of us are free until everyone is free. The content of this talk developed as a sideline of my research on the far right and the historical continuation of the political violence of the far right, alongside the perpetuation of the political form of the neoliberal state, and in particular with some of what I thought were the frustrations, or some frustrations I had on the way that some aspects of the presence of the far right were understood, and in particular how we understood the capitalist state. So I'm gonna begin by maybe framing a bit what I think the far right is doing as a political form, and then I will provide some of, I would say, tentative notes on how I've been trying to approach this question and solve some of the perhaps paradoxes that emerge here, with the aim of maybe helping us to navigate political conjuncture in a more like, in a different way, I guess. So here, the last 18th and 19th of May, and as part of a campaign for the European elections, the Spanish far-right Vox organized a conference gathering leaders of key far-right parties across what they call the Occidental civilization. They portrayed a Occidental civilization whose moral values, cultural and ethnic identity, they claim, are under threat by the evil forces of socialism, but they see actually growing everywhere. In a very perspective which seems a bit confusing, they consider the neoliberal period as actually a form of totalitarianism, which is connected to the way they understand socialism as an alternative form of totalitarianism, precisely because both reduce all aspects of life to an economic factor. And in particular, in this gathering, they all agree that there are three main forms through which socialism and the socialist character of Brussels and its institutions is currently being expressed. There is the politicization of race, of gender, and of nature, or the climate, more specifically. And in particular, they all agree that the socialist left, controlling Brussels, according to their view, is an enemy of nature. Is an enemy of nature by destroying the sex binary through the ideological imposition of gender theory, by destroying white families with opening borders and furthering the erasure of what I think is ethnic Europeans, by the politics of radical Islam, or by claiming that men activities are actually responsible of climate change. Meloni states in this conference that we are conservatives, she says, and we love nature. And the difference are that we want to defend nature with man inside. I will return to this quote at the end of the talk. In general, the far right then portrays these Europe's evils as resulting from some like expansion of the market to all aspects of life, including those aspects of life that have to do with something that should belong to nature, like sex, for instance. And hence the far right wants to redraw the boundaries of the economic, the political, and nature. They want to expel the global economic elites from the state and recover politics as autonomous from the economy and society at large. They want to free the market from the interference of the state and trade unions and let it become the arbiter of justice and freedom through the equality of capital and labor as private property owners. They want to reconstruct the nexus between culture and nature as a way of desocializing from the market some social reproductive activities that have endangered the otherwise naturalness of sex and its cultural expression through gender, and to preserve the decreasing pool of surplus value distributed in the form of wages and a very thin welfare state to native Europeans, pursuing the politics of expulsion and strengthening borders and migration rules. So fascism is a particular radical instance of the political form of the far right, which I argue represents a logic of integration, de-integration, and expulsion. On the one hand, we have the integration of labor to capital through a racially and gender patrol wage relation at the mercy of the mute compulsion of the market, while simultaneously politically de-integrating part of the socialized labor as non-labor, particularly in matters of social reproduction, which they see as denaturalized in the role of women in society, but also expelling some bodies from the wage relation altogether and rendering as non-labor. The execution of the latter two is inseparable from forms of political and personal violence, racial and gender violence many times, that exceed at any time and at times seems even to be an irrational excess to that of a narrowly defined market logic. And many times it's even contradictory to the market interests, you could say. So the political question is then how to conceptualize these two movements together and how we understand the political relevance of the far right. Can we avoid conceptualizing the far right as simply functional to the conditions of capitalist accumulation or the interests of some particular capitalist fractions? A view as such would reduce the political to an expression of a determined aspect of economic laws, and leaves little room for strategizing its opposition and overcoming, particularly with respect to the potentials of class struggle. And can we think of racial and gender violence that always accomplishes the politics of the far right as something other than a form of scapegoatism, mobilized for processes of class decomposition and instrumental to the subordination of labor to capital? This, we can think, would bring the question of class struggle back to the question, to the argument, but in the sense that this sort of ideological mobilization sharpen the conditions of exploitation as they are policed. But I think it expresses, at the expenses of making gender and race, violence, an ideological and perhaps even secondary dimension of the fight against the far right, a politics of labor that takes labor maybe in its narrow or capitalist form. So I want to follow Amy Deat's invitation to develop a systematic analysis of what often is understood in terms of gratuitous and symbolic violence. And this is the path I'm going to take, and how I'm going to continue the talk. So how do we think about, first of all, what is the political under capitalism? So I'm going to talk about the way in which Simon Clarke and those in the Conference of the Socialist Economists thought about this question. Reflecting on the conditions for the re-engagement with the question of the capitalist state around the 1970s, as it emerged within the Conference of Socialist Economists and beyond, Simon Clarke stated that it was increasingly clear that the future course of economic and social development of capitalist societies was not a matter of the unfolding of economic laws, whether Marxist or neoclassical, but could be determined as the outcome of social and political struggles. On the other hand, it was equally clear that the outcome of such struggles could not be determined merely by the will and determination of the forces in play, but could also be circumscribed by the economic, political, and ideological frameworks within which they were fought. The renewal of the class struggle from the late 1969s brought to the fore the theoretical question of the relationship between economics and politics, or between structure and struggle, in determining the role of the capitalist state. In particular, the emergence of the new right posed a challenge to traditional Marxist conceptions of the class character of the capitalist state, especially as neoliberalism take out a lot of those state institutions that had been theorized as essential to the reproduction of capital, and therefore as essential of a state, as a capitalist state. But the political relevance of this new engagement with the question of the state was actually central. Either the apparent withdrawal of the state from what Althusser had considered the ideological state apparatuses responsible of reproducing the conditions of production, signal the emergence of a new regime of accumulation, which had to be derived from the self-unfolding of the capital relation, and which was consolidated at a level of, as a hegemonic bloc through agreements of capitalist fractions, or the rise of the new right and the political form it ideologically defended, was to be explained as resulting from the historical evolution and the relationship between capital and labor that precede that phase, and particularly, as Clarke considered, by the big defeats of the 60s and 70s. Clarke was on the position of the latter and argued for the political significance of working class organization and class struggle as considered not only a reaction to unstructurally given circumstances, by itself containing the potential for the negations of the conditions of life under capitalism and the creation of a new world. Nonetheless, to return to the question of class struggle meant as well for Simon Clarke and those around him to go beyond exploitation and production when we think about this. Hence, Simon Clarke reflects the immediate relationship, quote, between wage labor and capital is not an economic relationship, but a social relationship which combines inextricably economic, political, and ideological dimensions, in the sense that it is a relation simultaneously of exploitation, of domination, and of ideological struggle. The ideological and institutional separation of these dimensions from one another is not inherent in the social relation. You cannot derive it from capital, but only emerges out of the struggle over its reproduction, so that economic, political, and ideological are complementary forms of a single social relation. So we start from the unity of social relations, and then we try to derive its decomposition in political, economic, and ideological forms. By descending to the conflictual realm of class antagonisms and its always temporary accommodation within the conditions of capitalist production as the appropriate level of abstraction for the understanding of the political and ideological forms of the capitalist state, Clark stripped the state of any preconceived essential characteristics. By understanding the separation of politics from the economy as precisely the result of class struggle and not its presupposition, the Conference of Socialist Economies at large avoided producing either economistics or over-politicized accounts of the state. Neither the state is reduced to just the expression of the interests of one capital or capital, neither the state is an autonomous political order with its logic of its own. So the question rests on understanding how and what comes to constitute as the political, organizing individuals as bearers of rights or rightless, and as a form of impersonal power that becomes a moment and a context for class struggle, alongside and as a condition of the consolidation of the economic sphere, through which what now has been customary to refer to as mute compulsion of the market is imposed upon all economic subjects. So how do they derive the political from class struggle and class relations? Capitalist social reproduction, or I'm going to read the quote, Bonnefel states that it is the insight that class relations are prior to economic, political, and ideological forms, but can only exist within these forms as the mediation that enables us to conceptualize the complexity of the relationship between politics and the economy. They start by stating what seems otherwise obvious, which is that capitalist social reproduction is reproduction as domination. And this helps us to trace what they mean by politics as a complementary form of domination of class struggle, or the domination of capital. So what is capital social reproduction? Why is capital social reproduction reproduction as domination? So for Clark and Bonnefel, under capitalism, social reproduction needs to be made a moment of the reproduction of capital. That is, the activities that we carry to reproduce ourselves need to be met through the requirements for capital to valorize itself. This means, at the same time, that labor needs to be confined within its value form abstract labor, and then needs to be purchased as labor power in the market as a condition for value to valorize itself. From the point of view of capital, actually, the social reproduction is carried through the purchase of commodities, and the social reproduction of the laborer is exhausted in the wage. That's it, with the wage relation, which contains a historically determined, a socially recognized human needs, are those which can be purchased with commodities, and labor as a commodified, as a commodity itself, as labor power, is presupposed. It just appears in the market. Marx refers to this many times. This, in turn, presupposes that the vast majority of the population is divorced from the means of reproducing life, so that we have no other choice than to sell our labor power to capitalists in order to reproduce ourselves. For capital's mute compulsion to operate, actually, for the economic laws to impose itself upon us, this separation needs to be constantly reproduced. This is already something that for Clark introduces a contradiction in the very nature of capital, as the very social form of production of capital requires the suspension of its presupposition. So one way in which he thinks about this, for instance, is by arguing that capital needs to constantly divorce humans from the objects of their labor. However, they need to create a collective labor in the process of production itself. And that creates opportunities for challenging this perceived disunity. But there are more ways in which he thinks about that. Precisely because capital constantly suspends its presuppositions, it makes that its consolidation as a form of social domination is always stable, like humans or individuals are always constantly striving against the barriers imposed by the narrow confines of the value form within which our lives are to be reproduced. And it is precisely because of this antagonistic character of the class relation that Clark considers the state becomes a moment of a moment of the mediation of class struggle as the imposition of the form of value into the form of reproduction of life. This moment is then taken away from the immediate point of production. It's a subordination of the worker, quote, to the capitalist in labor process is not imposed only by capitalist technology, however much the attempt to impose such a subordination is considered in the design of that technology, but it's only imposed through a constant struggle over the subordination of the collective laborer to the expanded reproduction of capital. And he considers this to be happening, or the importance to be looking at how this happens in society at large. So it's not only an economic struggle, but it's more fundamentally as a struggle over the reproduction of worker as worker for capital, which happens at other points of society as well. So class struggle for Clark is defined as labor's coordinated effort to resist its incorporation into the value form as wage labor, which means both the constant subordination of individual and collective needs to the limits of value and the separation of the individuals from the conditions of life in other ways than those mediated through the market, whether directly or indirectly. He doesn't get into the details with this. So for Clark, the state appears in its political form as a moment of the mediation of this contradiction and a way of temporarily resolving the antagonism between capital and labor by providing what he calls the concessions and repressions, which constitute the temporary accommodation of class struggle, and specifically by defining the form of the relationship between the political and the economic. So here we can think about the development of welfare state measures, and what he's trying to do is to shift the focus not on what the state provides, but how the state provides for the things the state provides. So we can think, for instance, about the provision of care, how the state could provide for elderly care. Would it be a way of socialize that form of care, or would it be through giving a subsidy to someone, private citizen, who will be taking care of this individual? How this is defined establishes specifically whether this process, like how the economy and politics organize different forms of mediating this process of social reproduction. Bonnefeld puts it in the following manner, quote, "This preservation of living labor, both in terms of the existence of the working class and the normalizing of the aspirations of the working class within the limits of value, is abstracted from capital as individual capital and conforms to the state's constitution as a mode of existence of the social relations of capital and labor." So the temporary resolution of class antagonisms passes through a moment of what they would call the class decomposition and social recomposition that is inscribed in these concessions and recessions to decompose the class unity that they see as represented by the capital-labor relation and as the underlying relation that sustains capital's reproduction, and to recompose it into the social collective identity, doubly subordinated to the rule of law and the rule of money, to the impersonal power of the state on the one hand, and to the mute compulsion of economic relations on the other, one as a property owner and the other as a citizen. What we see in this work is what I call a logic of integration, as that which constitutes the constant reproduction of the relations of production and organizes the resolution of class struggle and class antagonisms. This logic of integration means that the political, ideological, and economic mediations of class antagonisms is resolved, if we follow the argument of Clark in this case, through the integration of labor into the value form. This logic of integration, I consider, is only halfway of the story so far. In particular, I'm interested in thinking, how do we then conceptualize domination within this logic? It is clear that for Clark, capital's domination remains impersonal, is either executed by the state as the rule of law or by capital as the rule of money, even if at times these forms of impersonal domination are mediated through personal relations. So the state and the coercive forces of the state are put into operation in order to subordinate labor to the value form, to wage labor, for instance, to incorporate the working class into its value form. The mute compulsion of the market is complemented by the violence and coercion of the state, alongside forms of concessions that are ultimately oriented to the subordination of the worker to the wage relation. Ideological forms of domination play an additional role in the reproduction of a disorganized collective labor for Clark. It is not clear within this framework how the sometimes very prevalent political investment of the state and capital in reproducing social differences through, for instance, race and gender, is other than an ideological mystification of an otherwise universal unity of the class relation underneath these different forms of political and ideologically constituted individuality. The problem with this is that in order to make gender and race as forms of domination and social differentiation legible within this logic, one needs to either universalize value relations. So we find that behind these categories, actually capital is valorized in itself, and then we can explain them within this logic, or seek ways through which capital creates differences through implementing wage differentiations, fostering the competition between workers, and it becomes functional in the valorization of value. Notwithstanding the importance of the way in which social differentiation through race and gender is also reproduced through these ways, this doesn't help us think about the dynamic I was trying to explain before, particularly the logic of de-integration and expulsion. So can we think about this through, or can we take something from here? The limitation of this account rests on what I think is too quick identification between the process of dispossession of labor from the conditions of life and the generalization of market dependence as a way of mode of social reproduction as domination on the one hand, and their immediate transformation of labor into value-producing labor or wage labor. Leaving aside the fact that there is always a fluctuating amount of individuals who have a very different relationship to the wage, and that constitute what Marx refers to as the surplus population, big part of the population exists outside the wage, yet they are trapped within the capital-labor relation in a distinct way. This is because, as a matter of fact, for capital to reproduce itself, it doesn't need to mobilize or live in individuals as value-producing labor, but just a fluctuating amount of them, which corresponds to the total social capital to be valorized, the magnitude of value, and the organic composition of this capital, and so on. This dynamic, I think, introduces some constraints within the capitalist form of social reproduction as domination that makes the process of this process incomplete if we only focus on the form in which it is mediated through exploitation. And in particular, value theoretical accounts of race and gender have highlighted two processes that relate to the above. One is our critique of the question of social reproduction within capitalism, and in particular, the reproduction of labor power, we can think about it in that sense. And the other one is the reproduction of a surplus population. Both dynamics highlight the permanence of forms of non-labor that mediate the existence of labor in its value form. So I think that we can avoid this return to the logic of integration, yet retain some of the insights of the political form of capital by engaging with some of these value theoretical informed works in the role of race and gender as constituted categories alongside the economic and the political. For matters of time, I will only engage with the dynamic, the first dynamic that I highlight, the question of the reproduction of labor. But I hope my approach serves to illuminate how to think the logic of integration and de-integration and expulsion from the capital-labor relation that is often mediated through race and gender, and organized through violence there, both at the level of the state and outside. So let's go to the reformulation of social reproduction. The Marxist feminism and social reproduction theory have produced a lot of engaged debate on the character and nature of social reproduction under capitalism, and whether Marx forgot to account for the aspects of the reproduction of life which are not fully satisfied by the wage. I don't want to focus on all these debates, but instead I will focus on a few relatively recent works on the question of social reproduction under capitalism that have problematized some assumptions within this field and that can be made compatible with my discussion so far of the political form of the state, despite the fact that many of them don't necessarily directly engage with this question. I think that can be fruitful to bring these two into conversation, hopefully meaningful for you all. I consider that there are three important shifts that are introduced by these works, which I call the move to de-essentialization of social reproductive labor, the move of the question of gender or sex at a different level of abstraction, of what I call putting the sex form in the movement of capital, and the new question of the substantialization of sex and how it relates to wider notions of value production. So these are the works of Maya Gonzalez and Newton, or Amy Diaz, Marina Bismuth, and Zoe Sutherland, and Beverly Best. But there are more. I will speak this specifically. So I'm gonna speak about the logic of gender and the movement of de-essentialization. So as some of you may know, in this call, The Logic of Gender was published anonymously more than 10 years ago in the Communist Theory Collective Endnotes, and since it has become a seminal work and reference for a lot of the discussions on social reproduction and the capitalism. In this contribution, Gonzalez and Newton argue for the need to abandon a series of dichotomies that had structured the debates on feminism and social reproduction, Marxist feminism specifically, and that tried to capture what was the specificity of gender within capitalism. These were the dichotomies that usually appear as production versus reproduction, paid versus unpaid, public versus private, wage as unwage, productive, reproductive, and unproductive, reproductive, and so on. So rather than focusing on this, they suggest we should focus on the formal qualities of the particular form of labor that the particular form labor takes under capitalism. So instead of thinking about the nature of the social reproductive work and those activities that we call social reproductive activities, Gonzalez and Newton proposes a form analysis of then the mode of domination that organize the different tasks as they are thrown in and outside of the market. Starting from the acceptance of the class relation as a generalized market dependency, which characterize capitalist societies, they propose to analyze social reproduction as organized through two spheres of social activity, the directly market-mediated sphere and the indirectly market-mediated sphere. And these are the ones that are in this graph. So on the one hand, activities within the directly market-mediated sphere are organized capitalistically. The labor involved in its production is then objectified in commodities and exchanged in the market. As such, market dependency or impersonal abstract domination, I quote, characterizes the form of social domination within the directly market-mediated sphere. Their existence as commodities that presupposes commodified labor. And those relations are reproduced similarly to the forms discussed above in the terms of the incorporation, with no structural necessity towards direct violence or planning in order to allocate the labor per se. Generally, and in as much as it relates to the state, Tasks within the directly market-mediated sphere are reproduced through the legal form and the money form. Activities carried through the directly market-mediated sphere thus take the form of wage labor, become accessible to the wage, and are subject to the same antagonistic relationships underpinning capitalist production at large. The subsumption and expulsion into the value form of many services previously supplied by private kinship relationships of care provides an example of how many of these categories are historically reconfigured through cycles of production, expansion, crisis, and social antagonisms. And this is the case regarding of whether these activities are productive or not. On the other hand, they suggest we need to look at what they call the indirectly market-mediated activities. These are the ones who are not directly determined capitalistically and, in most cases, remain unwaged and must count as non-labor. Crucially, the existence of this sphere corresponds to this existence of specific activities needed to life, to the reproduction of life, that cannot be, have not yet been, or have ceased to be accounted for within the directly market-mediated sphere as commodities. In short, goods, services, and social relations necessary to reproduce life, but inaccessible to the wage. So insofar as these activities remain unwaged and posited as non-labor, the form of domination within these spheres differs from the abstraction characteristic of the directly market-mediated sphere. They quote, I quote, from direct domination and violence to hierarchical forms of cooperation or plan allocation at best. The form of the relationship between the state and civil society, and hence the form and content of the state and its institutions. Sorry, it's very loud. Something that the above discussion, so like the form and relationship between the state and civil society, and hence the form and content of the state and its institutions, something that if we connect to the above discussion is characterized as the object and result of class struggle, is here in this picture seen as incorporated into the overlap between those two spheres, as we say, those services and set of wage activities that are provided outside of the market by the state redistribution of part of the social surplus, alongside the remnant activities that are thrown into what they call the object sphere. While Gonzalez and Newton seem to see these spheres constitution as the structural logic of value, we can already see that it has the result of a process of class struggle, if we follow the definition I was proposing before, following the above discussion. But I will return to this at the end. So importantly, and to link it to the question of the mediation of exploitation open above, is what then remains outside of the market and this overlap with the state. This is the outside that they originally term the gender sphere, which, as they develop their historical analysis, then they rename as the object sphere. And for them, the subject sphere contains denaturalized social reproductive activities that then need to be pushed out or have been pushed out of the market and the state and need to be pushed in to other individuals. They need to be taken. They need to take them upon them. And they consider this is always an antagonistic relation, especially when denaturalization have already happened. What I want to take from here is the idea that the structural reproduction of this object sphere requires relations of direct domination, as they argue, that usually involve racial and gender violence, and socially constituted notions of gender and race that mediates the reproduction of life outside of the state and the wage, but also that the constitution of this sphere exists alongside the constitution of the state and the market. And that already introduced the dimension that we have lost in the previous discussion. So briefly going to Bess, and then I will move to Amy, and then I will wrap up. Sex as a class relation. In Wages for Housework Redox, Social Reproduction and the Utopian Dialectics of the Value Form, Beverly Best makes a poignant critique of Endnote's account of the logic of gender as the internal logic of capital, and help us bring this discussion a bit closer to the above discussion of the state. So I read Best as shifting the focus from any concerns or derivations of the nature or character of gender and the capitalism from the point of view of capital into the conflictual realm of class relations in capitalism. So one of the key contributions, I think, from Best is the argument that actually, from the point of view of capital, capital can completely disregard itself from the reproduction of life. This is not a blind spot in, say, Marxism. And this is the case, and she takes a point that I made before, that, like in this discussion, that this is the case because actually capital always produces more dispossessed laborers than those that capital needs for its own valorization. It produces surplus population. As a matter of fact, she reminds us that this is how Marx defines capital as a moving contradiction, as a contradiction because it constantly pushes labor outside of the value relation while systematically positing labor as the only form of surplus value or the value production. Although most of the social reproductive theory takes the non-coincidence between the reproduction of capital and the reproduction of life as a whole as precisely the point of departure and proof of the logical and formal necessity of gender for the reproduction of capital, Best argues that this is precisely what makes capital indifferent to gender. However, gender prevails. So what do we do with this question? For Best, what we need to do is to move away from the abstract logic of capital into the conflictual realm of class relations, or to the world as it is, as Marx calls it, where things appear upside down. So from this point of view, we can start elucidating ways in which capital is competition, and the competition to capture capitalist competition can operate in ways that, in trying to reduce variable capital, pushes away from the wage social needs that need to be met by someone else. And this is a way in which we can start thinking about gender. But I'm not going to get into the way in which she then talks about this, where I want to move quickly to Amy Diaz. What is important here is that she considers that if there is anything that we can say about gender at all, it needs to be derived from the reproduction of the capital-labor relation and the capital-capital relation, not from the general logic of capital. So Amy follows on that. And this is precisely Amy Diaz's preoccupation and her way of conceptualizing the changing shapes of gender and racial forms under capitalism. Diaz's works focuses on deepening our understanding of gender social relations at a systematic level, so that we can grasp what is otherwise, as I said, gratuitous or symbolic violence. And in order to do so, she moves from the analysis of the cultural determinations of gender to the social relations that substantiate and occlude themselves behind a pre-social appearance of gender or sex. The art tries to introduce a correction to some prevailing understandings of gender and sexuality that, for instance, emphasize the connection to the state's institutional involvement in the reproduction of the conditions of production, and with it the reproduction of gender and sexual forms that she considers like Floyd's account exemplifies, which give a primacy to politics over, say, other economic processes in the thinking of gender. Instead, she proposes a move to the formal analysis of value as perhaps providing with a better point of departure for the understanding of a prevalence of direct forms of coercion alongside the mute compulsion of the market. So how do we think about this impersonal mute compulsion of the market turning upside down into direct forms of violence? So returning to the question of labor within capitalism, or what counts as labor within capitalist societies, the art argues with the form of labor the art engages with the form labor takes within the two spheres discussed above, and particularly with the temporality of wealth under capitalism. And precisely at this level, considers that there are incompatibilities between the abstract time of capital, which underscores abstract labor as an equalizer, and the substance of value, and what she considers following posthum historical time. The art argues that the time indeterminacy of some life-sustaining activities, like childcare, for instance, made it so that their reducibility to the category of abstract labor and socially necessary labor time is a difficult or at least precarious process, and is full of social antagonisms by necessity when it needs to be incorporated into the value form. It is precisely this relation to temporality what makes some needs to count as legible within capital. As she puts it, indeed, the negative inverted dimension of the concept of outlaw need is compelling in this regard because it describes an impersonal operation, a structural and mediated withholding, rather than a more active form of personal oppression, albeit in an operation with highly personal and necessary results. End quote. So important in the art's argument is the fact that it is precisely this anti-humanist, subjectless mode of domination of the market and its imperative to valorize value imposed upon every of the participants in the economy that actually historically articulates the imposition of outlaw needs in a dynamic way. It's an impersonal process that turns inside out by fostering very concrete and personal forms of domination in order to anchor and mediate the frontiers of this inside and outside of the legibility of the wage. It is here where the art apprehends something of the social substance of gender or sex and the role of gender in mediating the contours of these social needs and its organization. Gender as a lived experience, when mediating this process, also acquires a different temporality, almost as time out of history, almost as belonging perhaps to nature. So the imperatives of capital accumulation makes it so that the always expansive and necessarily open horizon of needs and aspirations of individuals are made to fit the narrow form of value that in the last instance determines what can be purchased with the wage as a commodity and hence appears as legible within a socially recognized need. While the rest for Amy is pushed as outlaw or illegitimate needs. So outlaw needs are then a way of conceptualizing gender violence in a negative way. Every form of gender violence for the art bears the mark of a need not being met socially. So let's try to bring things together and to close down. The art then turns to the logic of gender and the role that the historical dimension of the object sphere plays. She states, object forms of reproduction differ from other indirectly market-mediated activities because after becoming wage components of the welfare state, they no longer automatically appear as the natural task of women, though, as Gonzalez and Neaton point out, object reproduction will in the end mainly be foisted upon women. Returning to the particular rendering of the process of social reproduction, as is articulated in the logic of gender, we see that the consolidation of a set of needs is not exhausted at the level of the allocation of directly market-mediated activities and indirectly market-mediated activities and their corresponding forms of domination through the object and the money and law. But it also involves the state as that which takes on a portion of these socialized needs that remain outside of the circuits of capital, hence bringing the political form of the state back into the discussion of the mediation of needs alongside gender, and race. But as a matter of fact, what is it the historical negotiation of socially recognized needs and outlawed needs, alongside the modes of satisfying them, if not the object of class struggle itself? Not to expand and contract the wage as the historically legible ground base for the needs, but also the form of the provision of those needs to the market, the family, the state, or beyond any of these forms value takes, to ultimately democratize the process of social reproduction as a whole, and to take it away from its brain economic categories that become the subjects and destiny of our own social existence and needs. Actually, this is how Clark derived the political form of the state and its class character. This is a long last quote and I'm finishing. So quoting Clark, the class character of the political state is defined by the separation of the state from civil society and the corresponding subordination of the state and civil society to the rule of money and the law. While the subordination of the state to money defines the economic form through which an overaccumulation crisis appears to the state and sets limits to the power of the state in response to such a crisis, it does not directly determine the specific political form of the state, through which the contradictory tendencies of accumulation are mediated politically, not the specific response to the state in face of a crisis. The political form of the state is determined by the class struggle, and most particularly by the struggle of the working class, which arises as the working class confronts the subordination of social reproduction to capital as a barrier to its own physical and social reproduction. So the inversion of social reproduction into its capitalist form as reproduction as domination does not exhaust itself through the subordination of labor to the wage relation alongside the construction of a depoliticized sphere of the economy and the political sphere of the state, but involves, as I've been trying to argue, amongst other things, the temporary stabilization of forms of social reproduction, of which then gender and racial orders come to mediate, and that actually express forms of direct domination, social differentiation, and hierarchy that allow for a closing this circle of social reproduction that is open by what I mentioned before is the non-coincidence between human life and the subsection of it, which finds its social realization through the wage labor. But likewise, the temporary stabilization of the latter, say the mediations that are processed through gendered and race and its forms of domination, is itself mediated and mediates the form and content of the relationship between political and economic orders that these authors consider the object of class struggle. So I hope here I've arrived at a form of conceptualizing both the state and forms of direct domination that are mediated through gender and racial violence as related to the reproduction of capital relations of production, without making a functionalist and a structural account, but rather see this relationship historically. And we could expand a bit more onto that. So while this account doesn't necessarily explain all forms of gender and racial violence and gender and racial domination, I hope it opens up a path to think of gender and race as a moment of capital domination, distinct from the impersonal form of domination of money and the law, yet complementary to it. I hope this form of conceptualization of these forms of violence as internal to the reproduction of class relations, without having to derive them from, say, pre-given economic needs, is entangled with the consolidation of a form of politics that is separated from society as the mediation of the general, otherwise general unity of life in its separation from our conditions of reproduction, which configures the field of class struggle. So I try to suggest this temporary accommodation of class struggle within the capitalist social reproduction as domination then involves the temporary consolidation of something that we understand as the political, independent from the economy, alongside and mediated through the consolidation of what is usually understood as nature. And here I can return again to Meloni's quote at the beginning, and Meloni's quote or definition of nature. One, as she said, that puts men at the center of it. But maybe this analysis shows or discover this man in nature as a mode of existence of labor within capital. I'm done.
Okay, thank you so much, Felix, for taking us on the journey. It's actually just the top of the hour, so we have 30 minutes for questions. Questions, comments, or praise, or anything. Yeah, so if you would like to ask a question, you can either unmute yourself or you can type it out into the chat, and either way we can put it to Felix and have a bit of a conversation now. Any questions? You guys are going to make me go first. Oh, there we go. Richard, yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for that. I'm sort of quite new. I'm not familiar with many of these readings, so it was quite dense for me to follow, and quite difficult to follow. But I liked it. It was interesting. I was struck by the mention of time and how time, or at one point you were talking about how time was sort of like made static, and it reminded me of Karshedi and his idea of technology, and how the sort of removal of time from the equation makes technology automatically a class weapon for capital. I was wondering if there are any parallels there with Karshedi's epistemology of and ideas around time. Maybe a bit niche there, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with Karshedi's notion of technology and how it like withholds time. In this, I was trying to follow Amy's try to like exploration of the mode of experiencing forms of gender within capital. Like Amy's here, so I feel a bit like scared of actually having misread some things. But what I take from her on her engagement with time is the idea that there are our relationship to, say, specific activities of our life, and in particular when you go to some social reproductive activities, like the time of the dedication that it will take to like psychologically hold the space for a baby when the baby is growing. But not only that, we can think about care in general as something that requires a sustained relationship with someone else, another individual, which as a form of labor becomes more unstable when it's need to be put into the form of value and become abstract labor. Like the unit of labor time that counts is what has been socially recognized as an average unit of time that is necessary for the production of that commodity as a whole in the total economy, right? So that produces a notion of abstract labor that is necessary for the recognition of value at the level of exchange, for value to valorize itself as it's content, and then to the objectified labor in the form of abstract labor in that commodity to be realized. and that process becomes more unstable in this notion of time. So I think I read Amy as engaging with the existence of two forms of temporality, one that relates to this abstract temporality of the production of the commodities to meet our needs, and the kind of temporality that is acquired by those needs that are considered to be outlaw or not eligible within this temporal dimension of capital accumulation, right? And if we stretch this to the utmost, we'd say that time becomes almost, that's kind of the suggestion I would say, this historical time, we could actually look at it more as a prehistorical time itself, as a form of, like, stretched to the limit is a form of no time. Gender is experienced as a suspension of otherwise, it can be experienced as a suspension in the cultural formation of what is otherwise the rhythms of competition, production, abstract time, and so on. This is the way the notion of time is being used here, and also following Poston's idea of the particular way time comes to be conceptualized under capitalism. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, that's useful. Thank you. And I think there is a connection to what Karshedi's saying in terms of science and objectivity and technology and the way time is understood. But I need to go and check that myself again and follow up these links to Potstone and stuff. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Bruno, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Felix, for that talk. So I wanted to ask you a couple of things. So first of all, when you were elaborating on this articulation between abstract time and historical time that Amy talks about in her article, entailing an impersonal form of domination and interpersonal forms of domination or personal forms of subjugation, do you think that has an impact on the on wage, if that actually serves to reduce wages for gendered and racialized subjects? And that was my first question. And the second thing was, sorry, I forgot. I completely forgot, sorry. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, I think that's a thorny question. In this talk, I try to emphasize the readings that allow us to find something of the nature of direct relations of domination, of which gender and race comes to mediate them at times, from the perspective of what is left outside of the value form, let's say, or outside of the wage relation or the value form of labor. But it doesn't mean that necessarily the reproduction of these differentiations exhausted itself there, right? And I think that, so to think about these things together, Beverly Bess argues something which I don't disagree with necessarily, which, and I think this is also in Sorenmau and a lot of other people in general, it's a very general reading, which takes on the idea that actually by pushing away more and more of the needs from the wage, and in some ways pushing them into, let's say, feminized subjects as those who are going to reproduce the life, capital manages to increase the surplus ratio, the surplus value that can be contained in a commodity, and that's a way, one of the tactics that capital can take, and is actually pushed to take through competition in order to maximize that. For Bears, then she says that actually what happens in this situation is an inversion, in the sense that if we were to consider everyone as equal, there would still be a difference in the value of the wage that goes for women and men. Let's say, she argues in these terms, because of the aspect that women come with a price tag. And she's following here, I think, endnotes in that sense. So there is a, say, level of competition between capitals and between laborers that produces social differentiation, which in many ways is also something that is already taken by the notions of the state that I was already discussing, that in principle doesn't give us a lot of hopes to the idea that capital would necessarily abolish these differentiations, because it seizes upon them in order to valorize itself all the time. This is, however, in many times, like when Bess says that this happens to women, I think she's presupposing the category of women to begin with. She's presupposing the idea that there is something that appears in the market already gendered as a woman, and as a matter of fact, is someone who's gonna take care of the kids or the other forms of life, and is someone who's gonna give birth. And it's not, for me, it's not a given that that's necessarily, or it's not a given why it is associated to the category of women, that they are the ones who are going to give birth, are going to be out of the market, and are going to take care of life, for instance. So there is another process which does not necessarily relate to the functionality of the appropriation of surplus value, but has to do with the managing of those needs outside of the wage, I think. And those things are connected, but they are not, to me, they don't respond to the same necessarily logic when we look at it from the point of view of capital. One needs to do with a general tendency to push as much of the population outside and to make only needs be met as much as they count as value producing or commodities. And the other one has to do with the particular conflicts that happen at the level of already commodified wage laborers, I would say.
Yes, Jules.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to do two things. And firstly, I wanted to offer some fulsome praise, as we said we were allowed to at the start. I thought that was a really excellent combination of thinkers, which sort of need to be brought to wider attention. When I've delivered lectures, trying to do the same thing, the kind of the familiarity with some of these debates don't seem to be especially widespread beyond Marxist discussion, and it's good to see them circulating further, including Amy Diath, who's just left, so I can sort of sing her praises without inhibition now. So basically, all of these thinkers, I suppose, well, Best and Diath, and also Kirsten Monroe, who's another person we could get into. I guess these thinkers, I would usually characterize them as sort of taking this anti-social reproduction position, which is a bit polemical, but it's also the title of Amy Diath's new book coming out soon with Sean O'Brien, that's been in the works for a little bit. So specifically, these are thinkers who are anti-social reproduction insofar as they are sort of set against the prevailing current within Marxist feminism, to understand the project of Marxist feminism as kind of expanding or extending Marxist critique into further understandings of oppression. And across recent years, I've sort of been pretty thoroughly convinced by the arguments made by Best, Diath, and others, I have to say. So it's been quite a joy seeing these sort of put together. I suppose, though, my question going on from there is sort of when we consider the point you put forward by Best, that sort of the beneficiary of not having to concern itself with these reproductive processes is usually capital. So like the needs of capital are sort of the benefit of this is that all of this reproductive labor and all of this toil and struggle is sort of outside of the direct remit of capital's valorization. Obviously, these arguments are sort of quite familiar. These are usually what we would call sort of like the indifferent position towards the oppression of women in terms of capital, which is to say, like, capital is based, capital has a reproductive basis that it doesn't need to get into the details of. And I'm perfectly fine with that. I think the question I still have outstanding from this, though, is concerning the rise of the far right, and I suppose the centrality of sex being perceived as breaking down, which the far right have clearly been percolating or like concentrating around in recent years. So I suppose like to say this very succinctly, having already gone on for a bit, I guess I'm curious about strategic ramifications of this position you're outlining for the current moment, and especially how far we can understand this, how far we can understand the apparent disintegration of sexed norms and so on as an outcome of these processes that are unfolding, versus sort of how many people. I guess another view of it would be that people have sort of been collaborating on purposely subverting, disintegrating, challenging, attempting to overturn these sexed norms and expectations in all sorts of different ways. And like what, how do we orient ourselves towards that, and what exactly what are we looking at when seemingly we can have an understanding of how capital and sex is supposed to operate together, or how capital attempts to make sex operate, but how can we understand that process kind of breaking down or seeming to enter moments of acute turmoil? Like how do we get from the big picture of the expected logic playing out to the recent sort of very chaotic history of sexual difference?
Yeah, that's the big question. Let me try to organize my thoughts. In my own research, I conceptualized the far right, and particularly their political attempt to reinscribe a natural aspect to notions of gender and race as the form of appearance of the edges of the market that are intensified at times of crisis. But I think that's in many ways perhaps like a very like common understanding of it. We can also think from this perspective of the political bargain that the far right is bringing to the table is a specific set of consolidation of the mode of social reproduction that should exist in order to redistribute the available surplus value within a particular nation, let's say, and to, as it happens, despite of how they feel, to actually continue with the social reproduction within capitalism. Is what I was saying. Is that this is always a double edge. It happens in the racial politics and it happens in the gender politics, where at the same time, when they cut across the distinctions that they make with people, they both subordinate the so-called, if we like think about England, which is where I am in the UK. So like English workers demand a job to live and a wage. They need to be pushed also even outside of the welfare state. Whereas we need to recover this like natural definition of what sex is, because like the law has been a bit like crazy and has laws of that, which then always comes with a definition of what a woman is, what motherhood is many times, with particular understandings of what the family is, as the locus of the reproduction of this process of, you would say, sexual differentiation, and as a form of mediating this social reproduction. So, and the same happens with race. To think about it in terms of a moment of class struggle, to me, gives an opportunity to take on this as things that we can negotiate, and that actually are constantly being negotiated, and not just they are not imposed upon us by the needs of capital in the abstract necessarily. There are many ways in which this could be resolved. There is no reason why the state could turn into some essentialization of the notion of gender to resolve this problem of social reproduction within the market. It could go through like the imposition of some forms of exploitation within the economy, for instance, right? But this is the role that the far right is trying to play. This is the way they want to resolve this puzzle. And I think what becomes important is to try to, for me, what becomes important in order to mount a real political challenge to this is to stop conceiving a difference between what are thought to be labor struggles that happen to be waged at the point of whatever employment relationship we have, and then like the social problems that we have outside in society in relation to how we understand ourselves and our gender and how it's been attacked, what the far right thinks about like gender or the existence of trans people living in the public sphere and so on, and instead try to like ultimately we need to develop a politics of social reproduction. That seems paradoxical considering I was taking this anti-reproduction people, as you were saying, which like seeks to organize class in a way that pushes beyond these boundaries. But I don't know, like that requires a lot of things right now and I'm getting lost. But I think that's kind of like the line through which I try to already undo these differences pertaining to different struggles and try to bring them as part of a wider class struggle without even having to turn into the discussion of like class first, gender first, race first, and so on, which I find it really undermining for any political project personally. I don't know if I answer that in any way.
Oh, I think that's great. Yeah, like you said, it wasn't the easiest question. Yeah, I guess my final remark would just be it seems very striking to me that the anti-social reproduction theorists all really identify the international women's strikes as like this key moment that brought social reproduction to prominence. So maybe I don't know, maybe the answer is just we need to have a very different organizational or a form of political struggle much more like the one you're describing rather than what we saw there.
Okay, do we have maybe a final question? We have time for one final question if there's one.
Can I come one moment?
Yeah.
What Jules was saying. I personally would be interested in thinking of what actually means for political organization to take on these critiques on social reproduction. So that is to take on the centrality of social reproduction as a whole, but not as something that maybe has been like, confined to these ideas of like a separate realm of reproduction versus the realm of production, which I don't think is necessarily been always the way it's been conceptualized. But there's been, at least among some people, a tendency to see these two things as separate in some way. So I don't know, like what is the political organization that responds to this analysis and challenges? How do we relate to the state in this question as well, with this analysis that I think are important to re-engage with from the 70s? And where do we end up with that?
I should also say there was a comment in the chat from Tamara, who is having internet problems. But Tamara wanted to know if you have a written work of your position. Maybe we could share tomorrow when I send the link to the YouTube video. Maybe I could share both some of the articles that you were drawing on, but you also have also your article, Felix, if that's okay with you. Yeah. Richard, did you have a question?
It was exactly that point. Is list of references, please, from the talk, and an article by yourself, Felix, that captures what you were saying, if it exists yet. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I don't have anything published on this, but definitely a list of readings. I can provide a very long one if you need it.
Yes, Sophia.
Yeah, I just want to say something in relation to the last point that Felix made about, what would be the setup where we could have this division. And I think the first problem that we're going to have is to to decide, because this is this contrast between the social reproduction and the other struggles is similar to a lot of other contrasts that exist in different struggles and in different problems, that sometimes one element has to be emphasized a lot in order to become visible. And the idea of social reproduction, some people emphasize, like if you say, well, we shouldn't differentiate, then they feel that the unpaid labor of women has been undermined, and all of those things. And I think the point is to find how to show that this is not being undermined, and how to find an action and a way of organizing that reminds us of all the differences inside, so that those people who are going to resist to take this route because they think that this is undermining this particular problem are not feeling let down. So I don't know if it's clear what I'm saying. I can bring examples from completely other fields of political theory, because that's not my area. I don't have enough language to describe all of those things. But quite frequently, when there are contrasts of this type in political struggles, these are the reasons, and we have to convince these people, and we have to decide what is the right point to bring those things together without de-emphasizing certain struggles and certain needs. So I think that's the challenge, to avoid the resistance to bring them together.
Yeah, great.
Wonderful. Maybe we should end there then. Keep an eye out to your mailbox tomorrow, because I'll be sending the YouTube link for those who want to rewatch this, and a reading list from Felix. Thank you all again for coming, and thank you for your questions, and hopefully see some of you next.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much, Felix.
Bye.